How you and your colleagues got interested in this particular topic about kids and the death of a parent or a caregiver, and how you work with kids in that situation.
We became really interested in the topic of bereavement because it is actually the most common form of trauma among both adults and children. And we also know that it's the most distressing form of trauma. So if you were to ask anybody, what's the hardest thing that's ever happened to you, the vast majority would say it was the death of so and so. But what's interesting is that the field of childhood bereavement and grief is actually years behind the field of trauma. And so when we really started looking at this, we wanted to pay close attention to how do children grieve and what does it mean to grieve in an adaptive and healthy way versus a more maladaptive way, because that really was an area that needed more research.
What are maladaptive ways of grieving, and what are some adaptive ways?
It's really difficult to define what is adaptive or maladaptive when it comes to grief. And part of the reason for that is because there are so many factors that play into how children grieve. So, for example, their caregiving environment, their religious or spiritual beliefs, their developmental level, the way the person died, all of that plays a significant role. But when we think about what it means to grieve in an adaptive and healthy way, this is finding healthy ways of connecting to the person who died, or living the legacy of the person who died, or making meaning of the loss. But when we're talking about maladaptive grief, really what we're talking about is when kids feel stuck, where they feel like they miss the person so much that they can't function, or they feel like they don't know how they're going to live life anymore without the person there, or they're so preoccupied with the circumstances of the death that, again, it inhibits their functioning.
Have you found that most kids, after a period of time, adapt? Is there a percentage of kids who don't, we need to be
Sure.
watching out for?
In the studies that we've conducted, we've found that about half of the kids that we interview, so bereaved children who have lost a parent typically, grieve in adaptive ways, and the other half may be grieving in more maladaptive ways. But again, that also really depends on the sample, meaning have these kids experienced traumatic losses? What are the kinds of environmental factors that may be influencing their reaction? But in general, most children who are bereaved will go on to lead very healthy, happy lives. But it's those children that may have experienced more traumatic losses or may not have the social support they need that will go on to have a bit more trouble.
What kinds of things should parents and other caregivers make sure that they're offering to help kids along?
So if a child is bereaved, one of the most important things that can really help them is having a caregiver that can facilitate adaptive grieving. And from our studies, what we've found is that caregivers who are warm and approachable, who express empathy, who are very present with their child when their child is expressing their feelings, and who encourage that open communication and emotional expression, those are the parents that usually have kids who do well over time. When we look carefully at other parenting behaviors that may be less helpful, what we find is that when parents are just trying to distract their children.
Can you tell me a little bit about the sample size and the age and what you and your colleagues were looking for?
The study that we're talking about today is called the Circle Project, and that stands for Coping in Response to Childhood Loss Experiences. And this was a sample of about, in total, 56 children, this particular study, where we looked carefully at the kinds of experiences they were having after the death of a parent, including intrinsic factors, so things like how they coped individually or their own personality styles, and also extrinsic factors, so how the parents were coping and other parenting behaviors. And the sample consisted of, again, about 56 children ages 7 to 13. The reason we focused on that younger age group is because there has been very little research looking at bereavement and grief in kids that are younger than age 13. So we really wanted to hone in on that group.
What you and your colleagues found and what those findings suggest moving forward.
Within the first 6 months of the death of a parent, there were certain protective factors that we identified in the child himself or herself. So one is expressive coping. So those children that were better able to talk about and think about and share their feelings about the deceased person or even the circumstances of the death did much better than those kids who weren't able to do that or who were more avoidant. The other protective factor that we found was called coping efficacy. And this was really how children perceive their own ability to cope with their own distress. So kids who felt more secure and confident, I can cope with this, I will be okay, those were the kids that did much better over time. We also found that there were some extrinsic protective factors, particularly from parents, that really helped children over time. That included what we call positive parenting. So when parents were positively reinforcing good behaviors of the child, parental warmth. So when they were engaged and sharing warm feelings toward the child, and also when they were encouraging children to talk about the deceased person. So really leaving those lines of communication open.
These days, we may have some kids who are losing, if not a parent, possibly a grandparent during this pandemic. And are there some strategies that you've seen from this research that parents can employ to talk to their kids about what may be going on?
Particularly if they're losing a family member, whether it's a grandparent or a parent, what we would encourage parents to do is, first of all, to validate those feelings that the child may be having. So the most important thing you can do is recognize what those feelings are and help the child to label those feelings. And obviously there's a developmental component to this, but what we want to do is help kids to really understand what it is they're feeling, because grief may be a very new experience for them. So one way that parents can do this is to model that themselves, to say things like, I'm feeling really sad right now, or I'm really missing grandma right now. How are you feeling? And helping children to identify that. The other thing that parents can do is meet children where they're at. So as parents, sometimes we tend to err on the side of asking for too much information from kids, sort of pestering them. How are you feeling? How are you doing? Or we may err on the other side where we feel like, they're not bringing it up, so I'm not going to bring it up. But we know that children are thinking about it. So one thing that you can do to really open those doors of communication is to say, I'm here for you whenever you need me. I know you may not want to talk about it right now, but I'm always here if you want to talk. So really giving the child permission to seek out that comfort when they want it. And then finally, one of the things that we're recognizing is that it's so important to use language that kids understand, particularly when we're dealing with something like COVID-19, really helping kids to understand what it is, that reassuring children that hopefully no one else in the family has the virus, that they're going to remain safe, and talking about all the things that the adults in their lives are doing to keep them safe and healthy. Because inevitably, if a child does lose someone to COVID-19, they're going to be thinking about, is this going to happen to someone else I love or care about? So helping to reassure them that there are many, many things that we're doing, that the government's doing, that doctors are doing to make sure that we stop the spread of the virus.
Do you have some suggestions for parents just talking about death and death on a broad scale right now, like what we're dealing with?
Sure. So one thing that I would recommend to parents right now is supervision and monitoring of what children are seeing through the media. So we know that even for adults, it can be distressing to see and hear those images that we're so constantly bombarded with in the news. So really helping to limit how much those children are being exposed to that. And when they do see or hear things, really being there to help explain. And instead of providing all the information you have, really approaching it from a need to know basis. So really asking the child, you may have heard a lot of things about COVID-19, and I'm wondering if you have any questions for me or if you're confused about anything. So letting the child guide the conversation so that you're not giving them too much information overload. I would also say that something that's so important for parents to be paying attention to is their own self-care. So we know that children are like sponges. They pick up on parents' own anxiety or distress. And if parents aren't taking care of themselves or thinking about what they need for support, oftentimes it's much harder to parent your child when you're distressed. So thinking about eating healthy, getting enough rest, doing whatever you need to do to get the support you need, whether it's reaching out to other family members or friends over the phone, but making sure that you're taking good care of yourself in order to be very present for the child.
Is there anything that I did not ask that you would want to make sure that people know?
I think one thing that we recognize in while we're experiencing COVID-19 and deaths due to COVID-19 is that the social support that so often is necessary after a death cannot be there. So, of course, we're experiencing that all over the United States where people are losing loved ones. They're not able to say goodbye. They're not able to go to the funeral. And there are some strategies that we're recommending to parents to try to help create more of that closure that's often needed for children. So whether it's writing a letter to their grandparent who has died and expressing everything they would have wished to have said to them, or doing things that they used to love doing with the person who died as a means of feeling connected in a healthy way, or even living the legacy of the person. So what was it that the person most wanted to do? And is there a way to carry that out while we're still here? So really thinking about how to make meaning of those losses and helping to give children the opportunity to make meaning of those losses as well.